One of the action items from the February meeting was to have the steering team respond to Kim and Greg's transition diagram with milestones, um, evaluated in terms of capacity. I think Dave Terrell was the one that suggested the steering team should take the time to review and assess the commitment and then respond with some recommendations. So in order to help you do that, I've taken the pie charts and the milestones and I've put it into a project plan and made some very crude estimates of commitments, time commitments for the PFC members as a whole, for the monthly meetings, for the subcommittees, and then provided a summary based on some assumptions of meeting dates for the committees and the PFC, including field trips, in order to get an estimate of total time involved. And so I'm posting this video just as a little intro and overview so you see what I've put together, and then there is a link to a hard copy on this thread of the forum in order to get a paper copy of what I'm presenting on the screen. So first, I guess one departure from the pie charts, instead of two projects, recognizing that Kim and Greg are trying to divvy up resources and allocate time between two projects, I'm actually describing it as three. The top one here is the Lost Creek Boulder Creek NEPA. That's a major activity for the coalition for this year. The second is the NIFMA phase of the Middle Fork of Weiser River. That's item number 2. I've added the Mill Creek Council Mountain implementation. I think that's an important part that the coalition still needs to be engaged with that project. And related to that is monitoring, and we discussed the monitoring at length at the meeting last week. Over here is a Gantt chart. I've organized it by calendar quarters of the year and then months within the quarter. And so for each one of these major projects, there's an overall timeline, and if we were to pan from left to right, you'd see from March through December of the calendar year. Let me just list the tasks for the Lost Creek, Boulder Creek. Now I've identified the major ones that we've committed to in the NEPA business process. So one is reviewing the notice of intent. I'm suggesting that we do that in 2 steps. One is posting it on the forum and giving an introduction prior to the meeting in March. The March meeting would be the formal comment or discussions to raise comments and scoping issues. The next item is reviewing the draft EIS. Kim had that identified or scheduled for July, so that would be a major meeting. Adopt comments on the draft EIS and submit them to the line officer. That's scheduled for no later than the end of August. And then review the record of decision and submit a letter in support of the record of decision when it's the appropriate time for that. And that would be probably the end of November of this year. You'll notice that the labels here identify that these things are generally commitments by the entire membership of the PFC. That's not true, of course, when we get to the committees. So that's one major area. Second is Middle Fork of Weiser River project design or NIFMA phase. I think it's important we discuss that there's not a need to review the entire forest plan, but I think early on it would be a good idea to review the management area direction for the council management area. And Steve Penny is working with Greg and the ID team to get that prepared. I think I'm moving this ahead probably a month compared to what Kim had, but we can talk about that later. I believe that step is important both for the Vegetation Committee as a lead-in to it and also the Road and Recreation Infrastructure Committee. And I'm suggesting the the steps for the Vegetation Committee to review data and discuss objectives. In the template that I provided, the objectives are blank, so that should be the meaty part of the discussion. I think a vegetation field trip this summer would be an excellent idea, using the June meeting for that to review examples, particularly if there's interest in expanding beyond the PVGs, as Ron raised the issue. This could be a time-consuming addition to the process, but a field trip review of examples would be important for that as well. And then the next step would be to define objectives and draft the recommendations for vegetation. Similar process for road and recreation. I think after the management direction, road and recreation infrastructure should review available road data and discuss objectives. I think it would be useful to have a field trip review of roads only and look at examples of different road conditions and a range of decommissioning. I think that might help resolve some of the discussion topics that have come up in the past. And then, similar to vegetation, they would need to have a meeting to define objectives and develop their recommendations. After those two steps are done, the PFC as a whole would review the recommendations and modify as necessary, adopt the recommendations, and then, similar to January's meeting, next January in 2014, the PFC would review a draft proposal which would lead to the notice of intent for the Middle Fork of the Weiser River. I'm suggesting that for the Mill Creek Council Mountain implementation, it would be helpful to review the 2014 work plan. That was part of the CFLRP 2012 annual report. I think it would be a great idea to communicate that work plan to the PFC, as well as discuss the next contracts that would be awarded, or the bids would go out and eventually be awarded for contracts in support of our first project. And then monitoring, I've broken that up into implementation and effectiveness. I think the organizational meeting is going to take place the organizational meeting hopefully will take place this week. I think the committee ought to adopt the business processes modified as necessary, but they ought to bring back the business processes to the March PFC meeting so that the coalition can formally adopt the business processes. And with those in hand, then they can proceed to the implementation and effectiveness monitoring. Currently, I've laid out these steps for both implementation and effectiveness, assuming that they proceed with the drafts as presented. That's obviously not going to be the case. There will be some changes, but at least in order to get an initial estimate of a schedule and time involved, I've approached it that way. So again, there will be a link to a PDF file that you can print out to look at this in more detail. On page 2 of the PDF file is a summary table, which is also important. Assuming that the tasks are carried out the way they're laid out in the project plan, and I'm making some simple assumptions about meeting days being a full day for the participants in terms of travel and participating in the meeting and going home. And using that, there is a table on the third page of the PDF file that summarizes the commitment in terms of total number of hours and days for a PFC member. That's primarily the major meetings, the monthly meetings, the monitoring committee, the road and recreation infrastructure committee, and then the vegetation committee. So it's a total of a little over 10 days for each PFC member. In addition, the monitoring committee is looking at 5.5 days, road and recreation 2 days, and vegetation 2 days. The field trips are scheduled on monthly meeting days. So, for example, a vegetation field trip would be in addition to the 2 days that are shown here for the vegetation committee. Now, depending on how deep people want to go into new topics, these committee meeting commitments could increase. But I think at least this is a starting point, and it at least is one way of communicating the commitment and helping provide some direction to the PFC as a whole and to the individual committees.